This is a relaunch for our society in Dunedin, the Canterbury Socialist Society. We have a fellow societies in Canterbury, which Martin is a member of. They run a very busy and interesting series of cultural and social events and educational events in Canterbury. We hope to do something similar here over time. Maybe we won't reach the heights of brilliance, but if anyone's interested, please leave your name afterwards, and we'll let you know if we've got any other similar events coming up. And also we have copies of our publication here at the Commonweal, which features, of course, a William Morris design on the cover, so there's a bit of a thing. After today's talk, we'll be having a chance for a couple of questions, and we'll be having cups of tea and coffee, which you're welcome to sit around and enjoy and check with us. So finally, I'll just say thanks to Toitu, Settlers Museum, and Mary, who's here today, for their great help in setting things up for us, and it's very appreciated and great being you for this event. It's great that they're supporting these things. Also just a brief note of thanks to Mark, of course, who's all the way from Christchurch today, and with a school delegation of members of the Canterbury Socialist Society to support him. So I think if we can give them a nice round of applause.
Thank you to the Untitled Socialist Society for inviting me this afternoon to talk to you about William Morris, and thank you to the Settlers Museum for hosting this. It's a pleasure, it's always a pleasure for me to talk about William Morris, who I've admired for most, not all of my adult life, and so it's a pleasure to come down. Morris was the founder of the Socialist League in the United Kingdom in 1884. And you see here a copy of the newspaper of the New Zealand Socialist Party, founded in 1901, and they took the same title for their newspaper. There were many admirers of Morris that came over here to found the New Zealand Socialist Party. Sadly, in my opinion, that legacy of Morris has long gone in New Zealand. And when they held a Morris Society exhibition at Canterbury Christchurch Art Gallery in 2009, a major exhibition which attracted 25,000 people, there was not one single mention in that exhibition of his politics. It was all about his wallpapers and his designs. And I then recently, last year, gave a series of 4 lectures on Morris to the Workers' Education Association in Canterbury and Christchurch. So some 60 people. And of those 60 people, only one knew of his politics. They'd all come to hear me talk about his wallpaper and his designs, which meant that for 2 of the lectures they were very happy, and for the other 2, not quite so much. And in fact, some were quite distraught to find out that this lovely man who designed these beautiful wallpapers was such a dangerous one of Morris's comrades, Ernest Belfort Bax, had this to say about what he and Morris were trying to do. The idea implicit in a few of those who belonged to the Socialist League was that of a Federation of Socialist Societies throughout the country, which would educate and organise public opinion, especially of the working classes, so that when the cataclysm to which the capitalist system was leading up, the societies might be in a position to give direction to the revolutionary movement. And here I am at the relaunch of the Untitled Socialist Society, following on from the establishment of the Canterbury Socialist Society. We have another sister society in Wellington, and we have 2 embryonic ones about to launch, we hope, in Hamilton and in Auckland. So we're hoping to follow on from what Morris and his comrades started to do all those years ago. Never, in my opinion, has an alternative to capitalism been more necessary. I'm not going to elaborate on that, but we live in pretty dire times, to be fair. And to quote Morris, we're living in an epoch where there is combat between commercialism, or a system of reckless waste, and communism, or the system of neighbourly common sense. Note that last phrase, nothing to do with communism as developed in Russia or China. The ideas of William Morris have always been an inspiration to me, and I think they're even more relevant today. And the Canterbury Socialist Society always has a little quote from Morris on the bottom of our literature, which says, "Our immediate aim should be chiefly educational, with a view to dealing with the crisis if it should come in our day, or of handing the tradition of our hope onto others if we should die before it comes." And that is what I hope to contribute today, is handing on that tradition to this audience. So what I aim to do is give a brief overview of his life and achievements. So there will be some wallpapers and some designs and some other references to his artistic endeavours, but I do want to focus on his political ideas and what I see as their relevance today. So what is it about Morris that inspired me? Well, Victor actually probably given a pretty good start there, because I am in absolute awe at the mastery of so many fields by one man, and his ability to switch from one creative activity to another, seemingly without effort. I mean, people at the time used to write in awe about how they'd see him in one corner of the room, scribbling away, writing poetry, and then he'd switch an hour later and be over here on a loom doing something else, and then he'd be over here writing his next stuff. They just couldn't believe how he could switch. Most of us, well, me, I find it difficult to focus on one thing and do it well. He could do so many. He was the greatest artist craftsman of his period. He was one of the greatest pattern designers of all time. He was a successful businessman, a renowned poet, at one time sounded out to succeed Tennyson as poet laureate. He was a novelist, a translator of Greek, Icelandic and ancient English, an environmental campaigner and conservationist, an educationalist, founder of the Count Scott Press, one of the finest of all private presses, and perhaps unsurprisingly, when he died at the very early age of 62, his family doctor said that he had died due to being William Morris and doing the work of 10 men. And above all else, he was a passionate socialist, which is how I first came across him. And another doctor said that he died a victim of his enthusiasm for spreading the principles of socialism, which I'll come back to. For many of us, youthful radicalism tends to fade as we grow older. You know, you read the biographies of many politicians, certainly Labour politicians, and they, you know, in their youth they were radical and they were revolutionary, and over time they gradually become either more conservative or more disillusioned, perhaps. Morris didn't become a socialist until he was 49 years old, and he got more radical as he got older, not less. So again, something I think which has been an inspiration to me. So where can I begin? It's important to emphasise that Morris's art and his socialism were inextricably linked. We need to understand the centrality of work, both to his life, but also to his ideas. So I'm going to take a brief look at his life before his conversion to socialism, examine some of the influences which led him there, before finally looking at the key elements of his socialist philosophy and what I see as their relevance today. William Morris was born on the 24th of March 1834. He was the son of a wealthy businessman, so he had a privileged upbringing, and he was what we might call a precocious child, a great devourer of books, who claimed to have read the complete works of Sir Walter Scott by the age of 7. Here was the first example of his ability to soak up knowledge with no apparent effort, continually remarked upon by his friends and fellow workers. From Sir Walter Scott, Morris developed his love of the medieval world and its notions of brotherhood and chivalry. His childhood was spent at Woodford Hall, the family home from 1840 until 1848, an imposing Georgian mansion set in a park right next to Epping Forest. And this was very influential upon Morris's later thought. He would explore the forest and the surrounding countryside, walk alongside the River Thames, and we can already see, even in these early years, his sense of colour, texture, structure and scent all developing, as well as an encyclopedic knowledge of birds and their colours and their plumage, all of which will be reflected later in his textiles and his wallpapers. His observational detail was astonishing. Aged 8, his father took him to see Canterbury Cathedral, and he felt as though the gates of heaven had been opened to him, he said. And when he first saw his medieval illuminated manuscripts, he was absolutely enraptured by their colours. His father died unexpectedly in 1847, and the family moved to the much smaller Water House, Walthamstow, which is now the William Morris Gallery. So if you're ever in the UK, I highly recommend that you go to the William Morris Gallery, where you will see some wonderful exhibitions of Morris's life and his work. But one result of his father dying so early was that his will provided for William to receive an annuity of £900 a year when he reached 21. And that was a considerable sum of money, which would finance both his book and manuscript collecting, his business, and importantly, later his socialist activities. In February 1848, he was sent to a recently founded Anglican public school, Marlborough College, which he disliked intensely, and where he said he learnt absolutely nothing. But it had a good library, and the surrounding countryside was rich in archaeological sites, which he wandered around for hours. His daughter Jenny later remarked that her father could make you see a place in just half a dozen words. There was no square mile of earth, said Morris, that was not beautiful in its own way. His biographer Fiona McCarthy suggests that when one of his places, his buildings, his areas of countryside, when they were endangered, he felt it almost as a physical and human grief. And one of the results of this was his key role in founding the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings in 1877, a highly influential society in the UK, which now plays a major role in ensuring the preservation of historic buildings. In October 1853, he went to Exeter College, Oxford, to study medieval history. And again, he was unimpressed, finding the methods of teaching dry and uninspiring. And his educational experiences at Marlborough and at Oxford would turn him into the radical educationalist of later years, the free schooler, if you like. His tutor at Oxford described him as a rather rough and unpolished youth who exhibited no special literary tastes or capacity. I think he got that wrong. I always wondered if those words ever came back to haunt him. At Oxford, he met his lifelong friend, the pre-Raphaelite artist Edward Burne-Jones, and others who would form a significant circle of influences and support for the rest of his life. Here you see Morris on the right and Burne-Jones on the left there. Burne-Jones would say that Morris was one of the cleverest fellows I know. And another friend, Charles Faulkner, commented, "How Morris seems to know things, doesn't he?" He would spend hours in the Bodleian Library in Oxford studying illuminated manuscripts and brass rubbings, and he would later advise the library on all its acquisitions. A few years later, he would be advising what is now the Victoria and Albert Museum on their acquisition of textiles and carpets and the like. This is how knowledgeable and how influential he was. At Oxford, Morris also began to write poetry. If this is poetry, he said, it's very easy to write. And there's records of him dashing off a couple of hundred lines, you know, and then switching to another activity, whereas most poets tell us that it's a mind excruciating, sort of tortuous process. It's very easy to write, said William. He published his first volume of poetry, The Defence of Guinevere, in 1858. But more significantly, he read the works of John Ruskin. And he came to share John Ruskin's rejection of a society which placed economic values above all others. This is late Victorian England, the heyday of the British Empire, the heyday of British capitalism. Ruskin railed against the society which placed its whole emphasis, it seemed to him, on economic values. And from Ruskin, Morris developed two key ideas. Firstly, the essential dignity of useful and constructive labour. He argued that the social structures of the Middle Ages allowed workmen a freedom of expression tragically absent in the Victorian era. And he railed also against the division of labour, that is factory work, which dehumanised work, he said, made it boring and monotonous, which separated the designer from the maker and the distinction between the manual and intellectual worker. And having worked on a production line myself, I can only echo those thoughts about the monotony and the tedium of that sort of work. Ruskin's second idea, second was that art had a major role to play in society, both as a creative activity and in expressing moral judgments about that society. And I'll come back to that when I look at Morris's thought later. A further event of significance whilst he was at Oxford was a 3-week tour of the cathedrals of northern France with Burne-Jones. And he was overcome by the splendour of these buildings. If any of you ever sat in one of the great northern French cathedrals, I'm absolutely not religious, I make no apology for that, but even I could sit in there and think, these are special. There's 700, 800, 900 years of history around me. The stone is worn away by the footprints of thousands upon thousands of worshippers. The stained glass, they're just amazing buildings. And he saw those as the product of community in action. And that led into the medieval guilds, and that of course fed into his later socialism and that 20th century movement of guild socialism. On leaving Oxford, Morris was articled for a year as an architect before he fell under the spell, and I don't think that's putting it too harshly, the spell of Dante Gabriel Rossetti, the leading figure in the pre-Raphaelite movement. The pre-Raphaelites, like Morris, looked back to a pre-industrial era, and they challenged prevailing artistic conventions. They, like Ruskin, favoured painting from nature, and that again chimed with Morris's own interests. And Rossetti recruited Morris and Burne-Jones and others to decorate the Oxford Union building in 1857. So you can see a sort of a fair chunk of the ceiling and the walls of the Oxford Union building there. And on the left-hand side, a specific part of the ceiling, because Morris soon discovered that his painting talents were somewhat limited. He was never going to be an artist of the calibre of Burne-Jones or Rossetti, but he discovered that he did have a talent for the decorative arts, for the decoration of buildings and for design. And that, of course, repeating patterns became the hallmark. Those of you who know his wallpaper designs and his textiles, those repeating patterns, you know, the willow bough and the strawberry thief and so on, that's the hallmark of his design. And here you can see the ceiling of the Oxford Union, which Morris designed and decorated. And you can see there the genesis of many of his later designs. When Morris married Jane Burton in 1859, that would be a whole other lecture, Morris and Jane and Rossetti and what have you, the couple moved into Red House, designed for them by Philip Webb, who was another of Morris's close confidants, close friends and fellow socialists. This house, says Stephen Coleman, revolutionised Victorian design, and it marked the beginning of modern architecture in Britain. Morris was appalled by the poor quality of mid-Victorian mass-produced goods, and with his pre-Raphaelite friends and associates, embarked on a scheme to design and produce his own furnishings for this house. So here we see the hallway at Red House, which is now open to the public, and in fact, I visited 6 years ago, I think it was, and they just, literally, that same month, pulled out a wardrobe from the wall that hadn't been moved for almost a century and discovered this wonderful frieze behind, decorated by Burne-Jones and Rossetti and others. Stunning, because it had been hidden from the light for so many years. Where is it? Red House, it's just outside London in Essex. Yeah. And there's some of the furniture that decorated the inside of the building. And there is a wall hanging, one of his first, some of you might recognise that as the daisy pattern, which is one of his most famous wallpapers, but it was first a wall hanging curtain at Red House, and it was actually designed by him and his wife Jane, and Jane did much of the stitching on that. And this is a much underplayed element of the history of Morris and Morris and Company, the work that his wife and his daughter did alongside Morris in that company. But the success of this and the sheer joy he got out of working with his friends and family on decorating the house spurred him on to launch the firm of Morris, Marshall, Faulkner and Company in 1861, later simply to become Morris and Co. The minor arts in England, said Morris, were in a state of complete degradation, and accordingly, with the conceited courage of a young man, I set myself to reforming all that. He insisted upon authenticity. He insisted upon mastering or reinventing old techniques himself before teaching them to his workforce. And there's one of their first major exhibitions of Morris and Company. They were exhibiting some stained glass and some textiles and what have you. And when it came to the stained glass, the judge said, "You can't enter this. This is original medieval glass. You can't put this in it." I said, "No, it's not. That's the product of Morrison Company. That's how authentic it was." And the key thing about Morrison Company stained glass is the colours, which probably even outdid many of those medieval windows. So I'll just take you through a few of the products of Morrison Company before carrying on to. So there's some examples of his stained glass windows at a church in Brighton, St Michael's, and All Angels. Here we see his earliest wallpaper design, Trellis, which is taken from the garden at Red House. Further examples of his designs there, pomegranate on the right and daisy again there on the left. Tiles for fireplaces and kitchens and wherever else you'd like to use the tiles. That's a sheet from Morrison Company's catalogue showing their various ranges of tiles. On the left here, you've got some of the furniture produced by the company. All these are screens embroidered in silk, most of them. Another of his wall hangings from the year 1877, artichoke. That is the frontispiece of an altar in a church, done in gold thread. That is the Green Dining Room at the Victoria and Albert Museum, one of the company's most prestigious contracts. Still there, still exactly as you can see it there now. Lovely to go and have a look if you're at the Victoria and Albert Museum. It was originally a cafe, and I always thought it must have been nice to sit in there and have a coffee, whereas now it's just preserved as the Green Room. Strawberry Thief, one of its most famous designs. I entered the museum. Strawberry Thief, just in case there was any doubt. A Hammersmith rug. I'll mention those later. One of his most famous tapestry designs, the woodpecker. One of the firm's most prestigious areas of work, tapestry making. This is one of the most famous. One panel from the Adoration of the Magi, which the search for the Holy Grail is the whole thing, and this is the Adoration of the Magi panel. And more workaday, if you like, furniture. The Sussex chairs, which you can see on the top two panels there, which were big sellers and well within the range of working people, and they could afford those. The famous reclining armchair, which are very comfortable, and other examples of furniture that Morrison Company produced. You can see the firm produced a whole range of stuff. Glassware, they haven't got any examples of that on the slide. Many more things that they produced. And there is the shop, 449 Oxford Street, Morrison Company Decorators. So, whilst condemning the mass-produced goods of the Industrial Revolution, Morris also disliked the fussiness and clutter of typical Victorian interiors. I remember as a child going to visit my grandma, and you couldn't move. The place, there were sort of 3 sets of curtains over each door, there were 4 sets of curtains over the window, they had to be lace, and then white, and then black, and then the curtains. Every inch was cluttered with ornaments and goodness knows what else. Morris said, "I've never been in any rich man's home which would not have looked better for having a bonfire made outside of it, 9/10 of all that it contained." He said his golden rule was to have nothing in your house which you do not know to be useful or believe to be beautiful. But herein lay Morris's dilemma, because the processes he used, these old techniques of handmade products, or meant he couldn't compete in the mass market against machine-produced and mass-produced goods. His clients were the very people that he actually despised. But if he wanted to compete, then he had to use factory methods, which went against all his ideas of creative and satisfying labour. So, on one occasion, he lost his temper with a client and complained about only ministering to the swinish luxury of the rich. And on another occasion, he lost a commission to provide a silk and gold altar cross for a church because he attached to his estimate the following note. In consideration of the fact that the above item is wholly unnecessary and an inexcusable extravagance at a time when thousands of poor people in this so-called Christian country are in want of food, additional charge to that set forth above, £10. Morris also hated the ugliness imposed upon the world by industrial capitalism, the pollution, the destruction of the environment, the ever-expanding cities with their acres of slum housing. And it was this contradiction between the society he dreamed of and the reality of what was around him which drove him to despair. But to begin with, he saw no hope of changing it. Reflecting upon this, later in life, in How I Became a Socialist, he said, "The immediate future seemed to me likely to intensify all the present evils, by sweeping away the last survivals of the day before the dull score of civilization had settled down on the world. Was it all to end in a counting house, on top of a cinder heap, with a Whig, that's the old term for liberals, a Whig committee dealing out champagne to the rich and margarine to the poor, in such convenient proportions as would make all men contented together?" But whilst he was designing his wallpaper and his textiles, running his increasingly successful business, he also wrote poetry. Between 1868 and 1870, the 4 parts of The Earthly Paradise were published. These were enormously successful and established his reputation as a writer. But in there you will find these lines which reflect his despair at the time. Famous lines. "Dreamer of dreams, born out of my due time, why should I strive to set the crooked straight? Let it suffice me that my murmuring rhyme beats with light wing against the ivory gate, telling a tale not too importunate to those who in the sleepy region stay, lulled by the singer of an empty day. Dreamer of dreams, born out of my due time." In other words, he feels out of place in this modern industrial world. Lulled by the singer of an empty day, that's what he sees himself as. Nobody's listening to me, I can't get this message across. And it was this despair which finally drove him into politics in the mid-1870s. He flirted briefly with the radical wing of the Liberal Party, but he also began to lecture on art, and he fused his long-held artistic critique with anti-imperialism. In Birmingham in 1879, he told his audience, "While we're met here in Birmingham to further the spread of education in art, Englishmen in India are actively destroying the very sources of that education. The famous and historical arts of that great peninsula have been thrust aside for the advantage of a paltry scrap of so-called commerce." And a year later he said, "I began to doubt if civilization itself may sometimes so adulterated as scarcely worth saving. And how can it be worth much when it is necessary to kill a man in order to make him accept it?" This is the heyday of the British Empire, and here's Morris standing up in front of an audience in Birmingham who've come to listen to him about art, and he's railing against imperialism and all the effects of imperialism. And he soon realised that the Liberal Party was not a vehicle for him. And he also began to realise that parliamentary politics in general was rather corrupt and was not likely to deliver the sort of society he wanted to achieve. And so he began to look for an alternative. And in the winter of 1882, he attended a series of lectures entitled The Stepping Stones to Socialism, organised by the Democratic Federation, soon to become the Social Democratic Federation, and an avowedly socialist organisation, and Britain's first socialist and Marxist organisation. He became a member in January 1883, and he wrote to his friend C.E. Morris saying, "Nothing can argue me out of this feeling, which I say plainly is a matter of religion for me. The contrasts of rich and poor are unendurable and are ought not to be endured by rich or by poor." And I must emphasise here what a radical step this is. What a leap of imagination for a 49-year-old man of his age and his standing to declare for socialism at a time when there was no such thing really as a political reality. There were at most 200 others in England at that time, in the United Kingdom, it might be England. He was a pioneer, but he was convinced that he found a solution to his despair. As he later wrote, "So there I was in a fine pessimistic end of life. If it had not dawned on me that amidst all this filth, the seeds of a great change, what we others call social revolution, were beginning to germinate. And 2 years later, in his poem The Pilgrims of Hope, he described the experience. And lo, I was one of the band, and now the streets seem gay and the high stars glittering bright. And for me, I sing amongst them, for my heart is full and light. I see the deeds to be done, and the day to come on earth, and riches vanished away, and sorrow turned to mirth. I see the city's squalor and the country's stupor gone, and we are part of it all. We twain no longer alone in the days to come of the pleasure, in the days that are of the fight. I was born once long ago, I am born again tonight. In other words, despair turns to hope. I see a solution. Before I look at the ideas that he developed, I want to emphasise loud and clear that Morris had already developed many of the ideas which would characterise his thought before joining the Socialists or reading. We must remember there were no English translations of Marx's work other than the Communist Manifesto. Capitalism was not translated till 1887, and some of Marx's early work remained unknown for many, many years. But in his lectures, The Lesser Arts in 1877, and again in The Art of the People in 1879, Morris decried the distinction between art and craft, which had occurred with the specialisation of labour under capitalism. He said, art is now the preserve of the rich. Ordinary people can't afford it. They don't have access to it. It's a false dichotomy, elevating some arts and calling them the fine arts above other arts, the lesser arts. Even more importantly, Morris anticipated a key theory of Marx, the alienation of labour, depriving workers of that pleasure in work which he regarded as essential. And in Hopes and Fears for Art in 1882, he realised that only a social revolution was going to bring about the society he desired. At this time, the British establishment probably regarded Morris as maybe eccentric, but still essentially one of their own. And in July 1883, they made him a Fellow of Exeter College, Oxford. And 4 months later, they invited him to speak there about art. Quite get what they expected. He launched into a scathing indictment of capitalism, which shocked his audience. The press lambasted him, but Morris didn't care. As he said, I've crossed my river of fire. I accept that that's going to separate me from my previous milieu, and indeed from many of his previous friends and mentors. You know, Ruskin was quite shocked at this outburst of Morris's on that evening. Burne-Jones, not at all sympathetic to Morris's politics, but their close friendship did carry on. Just a word about terminology. Morris called himself a communist. He didn't wish to qualify that word by associating it with any other. It was not the word in common usage at that time. It was usually prefixed or suffixed with the word anarchist, anarchist, communist, communist, anarchist. There was no such thing as a Marxist at that time. People who read Marx and identified themselves with him called themselves social democrats. How the meaning of words can change. He used the term, in my opinion, precisely because it distinguished him from other schools of socialist thought. I think if we want to describe him today, I think the phrase I would be most comfortable with is a libertarian communist. As long as we dissociate that word from its 20th century connotations. Because if we don't do that, then we have a completely false picture of what Morris was about. I haven't got time to talk in detail about the events of Morris's socialist years. Morris threw himself into activity just like in all other aspects of his life. He was soon elected to the executive of the Social Democratic Federation, and with Henry Heinemann, its founder, wrote a summary of the Principles of Socialism. A summary of the Principles of Socialism that you can see on the left there, and he designed the membership card of the Democratic Federation, which you can see on the right there. In December 1884, he earned a breakaway from the organisation to form the Socialist League. And because I do like to advertise, so there's the membership card of the Socialist League on my t-shirt, so we've got all things here. Where 3 things stand out. First of all is internationalism. Secondly, his commitment to women's liberation. Morris was firm that he did not consider a man as a socialist at all who is not prepared to admit the equality of women. We're talking at a time when women anywhere else, not even here yet. You were the first. So that's another pretty radical statement for a man of his standing to make. And also his firm belief that the road to socialism would necessitate a seizure of state power. It wouldn't come through Parliament because no amount of administrative reforms would make any real difference, he thought, to the inequalities in society. I need to point out here as well that during the 1880s and 1890s, international socialism was preoccupied by questions of strategy. Okay, so this is not Morris being sort of a one-off. All socialists at this time believed two things. One, that socialism was inevitable, and two, that it was going to happen pretty soon. That was a bit disappointing. But the question was how to achieve it. Okay? How do we get to this? Marx has told us that, history is a series of society is a series of historical processes from primitive society through feudalism, bourgeois revolution, capitalism, and socialism is the final inevitable stage of that. Because it's created its own destroyer, the mass working class. And they eventually will overturn this system of exploitation and inaugurate a new era of socialism. They all believe that, but the question was how to get there. And so you see these debates all the time between what we might call the political socialists, those who believe that what we needed was to get the ballot, get the vote, and then we would vote for a socialist government who would come to power and, hey presto, inaugurate a socialist state. Against those, what came to be called anarchists, although actually a much more accurate term would be non-political socialists, are those who say, get real. Do you think honestly that if we elect a socialist government who tries to inaugurate a socialist revolution, that the forces of the state, the forces of business, of capital, are going to stand back and let us do that? They'll resist. So we have to have other ways of achieving our goal, and those around Kropotkin, for example, was one of his chief opponents, one of Marx's chief opponents after Bakunin, argued that what they had to do was adopt the principle of direct action, organising the trade unions or syndicates to confront the forces of bourgeois capital without mediation, via a general strike, and via, if necessary, resistance. I've got to emphasise again context. There hasn't been a Russian revolution. There hasn't been any revolution. What we've got are people filled with hope that this is a pretty awful world we're living in, and we can change it. And Marx has taught us it's inevitable, but the question is, he doesn't tell us how to do it. And so this debate is going on, and Morris is part of that. And until 1896, it was possible to advocate both strategies. But at the London Congress of the Second Socialist International that year, the non-political socialists, or the anarchists as they came to be called, were expelled. Now, Morris took great pains to distinguish himself from the anarchists, and again, anarchism's got a pretty poor reputation. If you only read certain texts, anarchism is all about bombs and violence and insurrection, which of course it isn't. But in 1887 he did call himself a semi-anarchist because he shared their antipathy to parliamentarianism, which he saw merely as another form of class rule. Morris favoured a decentralised and federal society, and in his most famous work, A News from Nowhere, he described revolution brought about by the direct action of workers, a long series of strikes followed by a general strike. For Morris, the task of socialists was to educate, agitate and organise. Three key words: educate, agitate, organise. To encourage people to see the possibility of a different world. A point I'll come back to that's really important. So that when the time came, it wouldn't be a riot and insurrection, it would be an informed choice about the sort of world they wanted to live in. But he certainly educated, and he certainly agitated, and he certainly organised. In just 6 years, between 1884 and 1890, he wrote almost 500 articles in the newspapers Justice and Commonweal, which I showed at the start there from the New Zealand Socialist Party, plus numerous pamphlets. In addition, he composed chants and songs for the movement to help recruit and inspire members. On the right there you see chants for socialists, and on the left here a death song that he wrote after the infamous Bloody Sunday in Trafalgar Square, where crowds of workers congregating for the right of free speech in what was an open space where there had already always traditionally been the right of free speech, and now the authorities have stopped it. And they were charged down by mounted troops and police, and Alfred Linnell was killed, and Morris wrote this death song for his funeral the following week. He travelled the length and breadth of the country to speak on street corners, in lecture halls, in dingy meeting rooms, to mass meetings of striking miners, and others, over 1,000 in all, an average of 3 a week. He fought alongside others when their rallies were disrupted, including on the infamous Bloody Sunday, which I just mentioned, and he was arrested. So this is Morris, the businessman, you know, now in his 50s, standing tall for what he believed in. He became the preeminent figure in the socialist movement of the time, and since then he's been claimed by many, socialists, communists, social democrats, anarchists, the Green Movement, all lay claim to Morris in some form or other. But before examining what I see as his key ideas, just one further note on his artistic endeavours. In the last 6 years of his life, he wrote 7 prose romances or novels, such as The Water of the Wondrous Isles and The Well at the World's End, which were major influences on the likes of Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, Lord of the Rings, Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. He turned also to the printing of books. He railed against the shoddy, mass-produced books with their poor design, their grey ink, which faded quickly, and the shoddy, acidic paper, which disintegrated over time. He studied early typography. He designed 3 of his own typefaces, and then established the Count Press, which produced 53 books, including the Count Chaucer, so that's the Socialist League there, behind me. You see Morris there, and a second row, white beard, and his daughter May in the front line there, in the middle between the 2 ladies in black. The lovely old ladies on the right there, sorry to digress, I do this all the time, are 2 refugees from the French Revolution of 1849. You know, still going strong, still labouring for the cause. And there's an ex-communard in there somewhere as well, that escaped from the Paris Commune in 1870. But the Count Chaucer, widely regarded as one of the most beautiful books ever printed. Although there was no Morris the Socialist in the Christchurch exhibition in 2009, one commentator, who I've yet to hunt down, described him as a beardy, weirdy socialist. Others have suggested that he was some form of Christian or ethical socialist, the Labour Party tradition in the UK. We need to put that to rest, okay? He studied Marx seriously. He read Capitalism in French before it was translated into English. And years later, in How I Became a Socialist, he said that he suffered agonies of the brain over the pure economics, but the historical chapters of Capitalism really appealed to him. And those words, of course, have been used against him to say, oh, he was hostile to Marx, he didn't agree with Marx's economic ideas. It's simply unsustainable. If you read Morris, and I'll mention this again at the end, this is a really useful small collection of his works, a really useful introduction. If you read Morris, it's absolutely clear that he accepts Marx's main thesis, that history is a sequence of class struggle that would end with the victory and emancipation of the workers, which would institute a classless society, and this world would have to be fought for. But the real importance of Morris's socialist years for me is in the appearance of many of his most famous works. The first of these, The Pilgrims of Hope, a long narrative poem based on the Paris Commune. Then A Dream of John Ball, where Morris uses a familiar device here. His narrator falls asleep in the present day and wakes up. In the case of A Dream of John Ball, back in the past, back in medieval England during the Peasants' Revolt, in use from nowhere in the future. But it's a familiar device of utopian literature to have this narrator who wakes up in a different age. And in The Dream of John Ball, he engages in conversation with the revolutionary priest John Ball, famous for his phrase, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? And Morris makes use of John Ball's voice to express his ideas of how socialism would foster truly human relationships. When he says, forsooth, brethren, the fellowship is heaven, and lack of fellowship is hell. Fellowship is life, and lack of fellowship is death. In A Dream of John Ball, Morris clearly illustrates his grasp of the idea of the dialectic, this idea that the struggles of medieval and Victorian England are essentially the same, because his narrator says how men fight and lose the battle, and the thing that they fought for comes about in spite of their defeat, and when it comes, turns out to be not what they meant, and other men have to fight for what they meant under another name. In other words, we fight for things and we don't achieve what we want, and then we think we've achieved it, and then we're disappointed and we start again. I could just quote an example from the UK National Health Service, where in 1949 we thought we'd achieved, and what we did, no, let's be blunt, it was a wonderful idea, a wonderful system, but it's slowly deteriorated and we're having to fight again some of the same battles. And that is one of Morris's things, that history is this continuous struggle for personal and spiritual liberation and for the ending of economic and social division. And then his most widely read work, his utopian novel, News from Nowhere. How many people have read News from Nowhere? Okay, I can highly recommend News from Nowhere. It's a lovely read. In 1891, shortly after its publication, Oscar Wilde said, "A map of the world that does not include utopia is not worth even glancing at, for it leaves out the one country at which humanity is always landing. And when humanity lands there, it looks out and seeing a better country, sets sail again. Progress is the realisation of utopia." And Morris's political writings are full of appeals to vision, identifying your aim, vision as a spur to action. He said, if you can't imagine a better world, how can we ever inaugurate one? So, News from Nowhere is Morris's utopia, but he's not saying, this is what we've got to achieve. He said, I want you, the workers, to think of what sort of world you want. Yeah? This is my vision. You might share it, but if you don't, then think about what sort of world you want. And in this novel, he describes his vision, how under communism, people, their lives, their outlook on life, and their relations with one another will be transformed. We find Morris's fullest expression of what today we would call an ecological society, a world without money, poverty, politics, marriage, and the tyranny of property rights. A world without wage slavery. And he says a great deal about work in News from Nowhere, and in another pamphlet, Useless Work versus Useless Toil. And it's the ideas in these two works that I want to explore. His reflections on art and society in the late 1870s gave rise to both his politics and his ecological ideas. He was motivated by two things, his understanding of art and his own personal experience. He wrote, I do not want art for the few, any more than education for the few, or freedom for the few. And he argued that art was the expression by man of his pleasure in work. Art, he suggested, extends into every aspect of life. Every one of the things that goes on to make up the surroundings amongst which we live must be either beautiful or ugly, either elevating or degrading, either a torment and a burden to us, or a pleasure and a solace. In The Lesser Arts in 1877, he reflects upon the simplicity of lifestyle, harmony with nature, the wastefulness of the market, and upon the nature of work. Unless people care about carrying on their business without making the world hideous, how can they care about art? He had already recognised pollution as the inevitable consequence of industrialisation. And as he defined art in the widest sense as all of human enterprise and expression, then for him a society which did not care about the destruction of the environment did not care about itself. The nature of work in capitalist society and how it can be transformed in a socialist society is another key element. What is an artist, he asked? But a workman who is determined that whatever else happens, his work shall be excellent. Look at Morris's life, and you get all these wonderful descriptions of him. Up to his elbows in a dye vat, learning the old techniques of dyeing with natural vegetable dyes, as opposed to the new chemical dyes, whose colours soon faded. Sprawled out on his floor, working on carpet designs. Up at 5 AM, learning how to operate a jacquard loom. Studying Persian carpet design before learning how to hand-knot rugs. Reviving methods of stained glass to produce the wonderfully vibrant stained glass windows of Morris and Company. Poring over medieval printing and learning how to produce handmade paper. And having mastered such techniques, then going into his workplace and teaching his workforce how to do the same. Work should be both intelligent and imaginative, he said, with the workers having control over their production, and their methods of production should be flexible enough to respond to individual work patterns. But the division of labour takes the creativity and variety out of work. It is routine, it's tedium, and we now have things like repetitive stress syndrome and all the things that come from that. And he differentiated between what he called good work, which is a blessing, and bad work, which is a curse and a burden. And the difference between the two, he said, lies in the kind of work and who it's for. Under capitalism, a tiny class of people exploits a working class who in fact produces everything that is produced and supports both itself and everybody else. And that work involves the degradation of both mind and body. Equally importantly, he said, it fosters a demand for goods that aren't needed. So although he never used the term consumerism, his description of a system driven by the production and consumption of new goods and by the production of shoddy goods which do not last, a mountain of rubbish as he called it, is a strikingly modern description of modern capitalism. It bred desires which he forbids us to satisfy. So it is a torturer. And instead of men labouring to live with hope of rest, pleasure and products both useful and beautiful, men now live to labour. Now, one of the main arguments that people put up against Morris is that he was opposed to all machinery, that he was opposed to mechanisation. Because he did blame mechanisation for the slavery of mind and body, but it was the use to which mechanisation was put that he objected to, not the machines themselves. He was actually very interested in new technology. He used machinery in his own businesses. He used the jacquard room. He used photography at the Commonweal Press, and he also used the lecture types there. He contracted out the machine manufacture of carpets and other things, but always on the proviso that the artistic integrity of the product was not compromised and that working conditions were reasonable. He travelled frequently on the railways because he benefited from the speed and convenience of them, but he complained about their effect on the environment and the inefficiency of the profit-hungry companies. Oh, doesn't that ring a bell? And it's noticeable that in use from nowhere, we've got quiet, efficient and environmentally friendly vehicles, powered by wind, for the main part, and by water. But most importantly for Morris, machines could take away this drudgery from work. Machinery, he wrote, will be used in a way almost the reverse of the present one. Whereas we now abstain from using it in the roughest and most repulsive work, because it does not pay, in a socialist community, its use will be relegated almost entirely to such work, because in a society of equality, everything will be thought to pay, which dispenses the citizen from drudgery. And he thought that in this non-consumerist society, working hours could be reduced to 4 hours a day, at most, for the necessary work, in order to free up time for work which was pleasurable and rewarding. So it's the context in which machines were used that he was against. It's the allowing machines to be our masters, he said, and not our servants, which is so injurious to life today. He's accused of hypocrisy for not installing this ideal in his own workshops. And as he said, he was frustrated at that he couldn't produce art in this profit-grinding society. Nonetheless, visitors to his Merton Abbey works reported conditions far removed from the normal factory. His employees were paid well above union rates. They worked an 8-hour day long before the 8 Hours Act of 1908, and observers of his workshops reported an atmosphere of quiet and some leisure, in which the workers, not harried to death, have space to breathe and to enjoy some of the repose and beauty of the world. One of his workers, reflecting upon the time there, said that Morris had introduced a real spirit of comradeship, and labour turnover was essentially nil. So, if work and leisure are to become synonymous, Morris says there's 4 conditions. 1, work would have to be a vocation. Each individual should develop their chosen skills to their utmost, and no one's work would be considered more important than anybody else's. The ploughman and the fisherman are as necessary to society, he said, as the scientist or the artist. their rewards should be equal. And the most important reward for work, according to Morris, is the pleasure to be gained from exercising our special skills. Second, work must be performed in pleasant surroundings. In a factory as it might be, he laid out his vision of a workplace which was clean and spacious and light and airy, set within greenfield sites rather than within congested urban areas. Like Karl Marx, he saw them as centres of education and entertainment as well as production. They will, he said, provide work light in duration and not oppressive. Education in childhood and youth, serious occupation, amusing relaxation, leisure, beauty of surroundings, and the power of producing beauty. And just to digress briefly onto Morris's views on education, he was appalled by the utilitarian education received by working class children at the time. This education and learning by rote, and the fact that they left school at the age of 10 for the most part, never to return. Epitomised by Gradgrind and Charles Dickens' Hard Times. Plied with useless facts, he says, one size fits all, leaving many functionally illiterate. If you've condemned a man to be a slave, his education must be that of a slave. He saw factories as a centre for education, providing apprenticeships for young people to learn and to develop their aptitude and abilities. People would learn because they enjoyed learning. And in News from Nowhere, the emphasis is on learning practical and useful skills, and books are available everywhere for children to pick up and read when they so desire. Learning has become deinstitutionalised as a part of life, and it was hugely influential on education in the 20th century, and particularly anarchist educators like Kropotkin, Francisco Ferrer and Paul Goodman, Ivan Illich and his Deschooling Society. All of these people are influenced by Morris's writings. Third tradition, work must have variety. Not the same thing over and over and over. Combine mental and physical labour, indoor and outdoor pursuits. And in a socialist society, everyone would have the same opportunities to do that. And he believed that few men would not wish to spend part of their lives in the most necessary and pleasant of all work, cultivating the earth. I have an abiding memory as a kid, and my father, who was a school teacher, as soon as he got home at night, weather permitting, off with his suit, on with his, out in the garden, 2-3 hours, and in the winter in the shed with his seed boxes and everything else. That total antithesis of what he was doing during the day. That's what Morris is saying. He said, we need variety in work. You know, we don't need to, we shouldn't be doing the same thing all the time. So in News from Nowhere, you've got people who are engaging in printing and writing antiquarian books in addition to their main job. You've got Dick the ferryman, who's just agreed with a good friend that the friend can come and do his job as a ferryman for a couple of weeks while Dick goes off and does whatever his friend is doing and so forth. And fourthly, work would have to be useful. But here he contrasted it with what he called useless toil. He gives two examples. Arms production. Useless toil, says Morris. Production of luxury goods. Useless toil. What about goods which meet a genuine need and enhance the well-being of the community, and which will be durable and long-lasting? None of this disposable goods which just create mountains of rubbish. One of the key problems in modern society, of course. And work and goods which will enhance the worker's self-esteem. Yes, he's not daft. He knows there is a certain amount of necessary or dirty work that has to be done, whether it's collecting the rubbish, sweeping the streets, you know, the sewage waste, whatever dirty work you want to think of. But that should be shared out. Why should it be just one group of people that have to do that dirty work? It should be a shared community endeavour. And once consumerism has been overcome, once people have given up with this search for unnecessary luxury goods and decided what they really need, that will free up so much time for us to do this variety of work. So his ideas about the nature of work then are at the heart of his vision of an ecological society. In How We Live and How We Might Live, he wrote, it is profit that wraps a whole district in a cloud of sulphurous smoke which turns beautiful rivers into filthy sewers. And although he was a passionate advocate for art, he saw a role for science too in the care and maintenance of a small planet. So what we get in News from Nowhere is his vision of a society of autonomous, self-reliant communities where manual and mental labour are integrated, work is satisfying and creative, and and where the divisions between town and country, between classes, and between science and art are eliminated. His belief that goods should be of the highest quality so they last as long as possible would minimise ecological damage. And he sees, therefore, a healthy, unpolluted and pleasant environment, and above all else, a sense of community. Surely, this vision is relevant today. It must be. It's assault upon the myth of industrial capitalism, that we can endlessly enlarge our demand and endlessly consume more without devastating environmental, social and political consequences, is apparent around us now with pandemics, climate change and the like. Just a few facts before I finish. Levels of inequality now are greater than at any time in the last 100 years. In 2018, the two wealthiest men in New Zealand increased their collective wealth by $1.1 billion. The poorest 50% saw their incomes decrease by $1.3 billion. 10% of the population here controls 70% of the wealth. You lose $21 million per annum to tax havens, and you have 20% of the child population living beneath the poverty line. You've got food banks, homelessness, people in work receiving benefits because the wages are too low. Employment is precarious, short-time contracts, part-time contracts, zero-hours contracts. The competition for profit still leads to industrial disaster with horrifying environmental consequences. So I would argue that Morris's message is as relevant, if not more relevant today, than it was then. He offers us a clear alternative: reduce our levels of production to maintain employment, a good quality of working life, and a shift in emphasis from quantity to quality, and a concern for environmental limits. He's a distinctive and original thinker, in my view, and is extraordinarily astute critic of capitalist society and the damage it does to us, to our social relations, and to our environment. He wasn't an idle dreamer, but uniquely, I think, he realised that the human imagination is the key to change rather than dry statements of principle and policy. How often do we hear, it's not possible, it'll never happen, we can't change things? How many of us have heard that? How many of us say it sometimes, nothing's ever going to change. Morris said, yes, it can, but you've got to imagine a better world. You've got to imagine it first. There's got to be a moral revolution. He offers us a radical imagination of an alternative way of life, which is ecologically and socially sustainable, and one in which both social responsibility and personal freedom are given equal emphasis. And I'm sure that would give us a far better and a far happier society than the one we currently have. So I'll finish there. With Morris in his later years. I've printed out a number of extended bibliographies there for a lot of those who would like to, anybody who would like to explore his work further and find out where you can access that. These are some of his own writings. There are so many books on Morris, it's impossible to go through them all. There's 6 volumes of his collected letters, there's 24 volumes of his collected works, there's numerous biographies, so I've just highlighted a couple here. The best general biography by far is the top one, Fiona McCarthy, William Morris, A Life for Our Time. So if you want just one biography to read, that is great. The next two, Hassan Mahandali, is a short account of his socialism. By far the best account of his journey from romantic, the artist and the designer, through to his politics, is Edward Thompson, William Morris. And then this little book here, if you want a good introduction to his work, followed by several of his key writings, it's that one there. And finally, a plea, seeing as Victor said at the start, that I used to be heavily involved in the Morris Society. If you join the William Morris Society, you get a journal 3 times a year, a magazine 3 times a year, and a journal twice a year. The website's got lots of interesting stuff on it, and has online lectures that you can access about aspects of Morris's work, so that might be of interest to some of you. Right, thank you. I just about managed to get it within the hour, so
for those who want to hang around. Anyone would like to ask a question, I'll just... Martin's used to dealing with a rowdy crowd, so I'll get him sorted out.
We'll have to take any questions or any comments.
I've got a question. Do you think if there was another William Morris Society event now, like it was in 2009, that anything might have changed, that his politics might be more acknowledged? Has anything changed in the last 10, 20 years, 15 years?
I can only speak for the UK, and to say that the last two major exhibitions there did have considerable element of his politics in them. So there was one whole section in the one at the National Portrait Gallery about his. So that has changed over the last decade in the UK, certainly. Here, I mean, Morris has a strange history. I mean, in Australia, particularly South Australia, he's very well known, and they've got a massive permanent exhibition in Adelaide, and some of which came across to that exhibition here. Here, as I said, his first impact here was very his politics with the New Zealand Socialist Party and the Commonweal. But then that faded away very, very quickly. He became important to a certain extent in the arts and crafts movement here, because quite a number of the people who headed the schools of art came from the South Kensington School in London, which Morris was an examiner at, and they brought his influence over with them. So he did have an influence on the arts and crafts movement. But from about the 1930s, so you had an international exhibition in Christchurch in 1909, where they had an arts and crafts section, and Morris was in that. And then literally from the 30s onwards, there's next to nothing until that exhibition in Christchurch in 2009. And there's been nothing since. So I'm not really able to answer that question. I mean, I suppose part of what I'm trying to do is, when I hear talks on Morris, is to say, hey, there was another side to it. He wasn't just a wallpaper designer and a businessman and a poet. You know, he was an active and confirmed and convinced socialist who believed that what was needed was a revolution. So we do our best. Yeah. I mean, I actually went to the art gallery and asked them that question, and they said, well, there's nothing in the Adelaide gallery that's about this socialism, and we can't find anything in New Zealand either. So, yeah. Andrew.
Yeah, I'm interested in that quote, like, you know, people fight for something and then they don't, you know, they fail and then they get it and they had to fight again. I got into politics, like, when I was a kid. I remember, like, my dad and his friends talking and my mum's friends talking in the 80s, and they're talking about actually the Labour government at the time, and they actually believed that there was like still like a working class, like, you know, the trajectory of history was towards like workers' control, and you know, the government in the 80s had a whole bunch of liberal reforms, but then neoliberalism came in as well. And I wonder if you want to like reflect on, like, I guess the gains of the '68 generation and how they've turned out to be not so amazing.
The parallels between New Zealand and the UK, and in fact most European countries, of the way in which Labour parties and governments have developed is quite striking. And I've read so many sort of biographies or talked to so many people of, say, my parents' generation, who, when the first Labour government was elected there, and when the first Labour government was elected here, how they had dreams and hope. This was it. You know, the world was going to change. They were going to institute a completely new society. Their life was going to get better. And then they described their gradual disillusion when it doesn't happen. And then again, in the UK, 1945, at the welfare state, once again those hopes are sky high and we're starting to do things. And here, you know, with the Savage government like in the 30s and so on. And then where do we end up? 80s, Rogernomics. In the UK, Tony Blair and what have you, and the hopes are dashed again. So that quote from Morris is about, you know, that we fight for something and we think we've got there, and then we realise we haven't actually. We've got to fight again, or it comes and it becomes something else entirely, and it destroys our dreams, and we've got to start again. So yeah, that's. I was disappointed as he would have been, I think, well, as he was at the end of his life, I think, and elsewhere. But And that, of course, was one of his reasons for his complete distrust of parliamentary politics. We elect these people who say they're going to do this and this and this, and then they don't. And then we elect another set of people, and the same happens again. So we have to fight again, and we have to fight again. But it was very clear, don't want to fight, we'll get there. I'm not sure if that answers your question, Andrew. But
No.
Here first and then... Yeah.
Thanks. I'm just going to follow up from those two questions, actually. I was 20, I think, when the fourth Labour government got in, and I would say that those of us who can remember that period would say that we were ultimately betrayed by that government. And there's been Labour governments come that have since had the opportunity to reverse the wrongs of the past and have chosen not to. And we have a government now that has a clear majority in Parliament that is not acting. So is it time to start thinking about a new left?
Okay, well, we've had new lefts. We've had new lefts. I mean, obviously, disillusion with Labour set in very, very early in the history of the movement with communist parties. Disillusion with communist parties was almost total in the end. And we had the new left in England in the 50s with Edward Thompson and others, and you had a similar sort of movement here. When Rogernomics betrayed you, you had the Alliance, and then Jim Anderson, so I believe, also then saw you down the river, going back to the Labour Party. We've had the same in the UK with Blair and so on. There's got to be, in my opinion, yes, we do need a new left. Not a new left like the old left, though, of, how can I say, squabbling sects and theoretical differences of fine margins and so on. I think we do. This is my quote there about from Bax at the start about educating. I think we've got to go back to something like first principles and go, look, we first of all got to try and recreate the message. And I mean, I can't believe that I see banners on demonstrations calling Jacinda Ardern a communist. Because that is just a total misunderstanding of what she is. And that's not a criticism of her, that's a criticism of the people holding the banners. They clearly do not understand what the word means. And even if they're talking about the Russian-style communism, how the hell you can equate Jacinda Ardern with that? It's just beyond belief. And she's a total antithesis of that. She might be disappointing to those of us on the left, but to call her a communist, well, so I think we have got to go back, and it's quite depressing in one sense. We've got to start again, but where is the left? It seems to have been submerged and vanished for the last decade. There was a fight back in the UK for a while, and it's still ongoing. To be fair, I mean, those who supported Corbyn haven't disappeared, and there's a much bigger movement there now than there was 5 or 6 years ago. But I think we do. Yeah, I think we do, because interestingly, so the Canterbury Socialist Society runs a monthly podcast, and this last one, and it's on the website there, you can see it. We interviewed Duncan Webb, who's the Labour MP for Christchurch Central, is it Tom? Or Christchurch? Yeah, Christchurch Central, and also a party whip. And he was asked, you call yourself a socialist, what do you mean by that? And the answer was, well, I believe in choice and opportunity. And the answer is, well, you don't have much choice and opportunity if you've no money, and you're living on benefits, and you're living in a wet, damp house or whatever. And then, why haven't you done something with your 60-odd majority, the first time in God knows how long? And the answer was, well, we only really had a mandate to do with COVID, didn't we? So again, my long answer to your short question is yes, we do. I think, personally.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. The thread within your presentation that I found the most interesting was kind of the aspect of William Morris as appealing to Labour as a health-giving kind of approach to life, and that Labour as opposed opposed to industrial labour as degrading and Sisyphean and repetitive and monotonous and all that, feels like an appeal to a return to what you might call the dignity of labour, to put it in kind of bourgeois era terms. So I'm curious about how William Morris's philosophy reflects his time historically. Specifically, I'm thinking of other writers in that era who were kind of writing at this time following the defeat of the Paris Commune and the like. So, for instance, Karl Marx's nephew, Paul Lafargue, wrote The Right to Be Lazy, and authors who are appealing to this idea of getting away from industrial capitalism.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, Morris was certainly clearly in that tradition of rediscovering that essential dignity of labour. I mean, what his argument was, in many regions, is that capitalism has taken away from the vast majority of people the opportunity to be creative, to get pleasure from their work, to, it's given them a life of drudgery and what have you, where, if you look at 19th century England, where their only escape from that at the end of a 10, 12, 14-hour day is the pub. Because they're so tired, they're so down, they're so degraded that that's just their only escape. And he argues, and again, you see, it all ties in with his views on art. Art's become the preserver of the rich, it's become the preserver of the specialist. Only talented people can do it. And he says, everybody's creative in different ways. Everybody's got the opportunity and the capacity, but they're not given the opportunity to do it. So he wanted to revive that, and capitalism, by producing this mountain of unnecessary. I mean, he'd be shocked by television advertising. I think he'd be throwing the television at the wall. Why does anybody want one of those? Every night I have to watch before the news somebody advertising one of these massage chairs with all those. So he would have been appalled by all that. And what he was saying is, given the chance, everybody can enjoy work, productive work. Leisure and work for him was synonymous. That's what he did. Don't get me wrong, he wasn't saying that there's no room for leisure, as in, he used to go out the river and fish. And he liked growing up the River Thames. So he enjoyed a bottle of red wine at night with his mates. But he said, if we're only working at the necessary labour, the drudge, the dirty work for 3 or 4 hours a day, then we're all freed up. And then we'll discover that we can do other things.
So would you have your nuclear plant, for example, your doctor or your nurse spend 4 hours cleaning sewers?
You want my opinion? Right, okay. If we live in a society where we determine what is best for us, then that is a discussion we will have. What he would say about that is, look, and I mentioned this, he said work must be a vocation. In other words, it must be something that we can. I couldn't be a brain surgeon. Jesus, no. But some people can, and they've got the ability to be that, and they're talented, and they can do that. But they still owe other things to society. They can't just be a brain surgeon and ignore everything else. And the reward shouldn't be any greater. So and he talks about, in the book about some role members and whatever that he's observed, and say, actually, some people get sheer pleasure out of physical work. Yeah? Some people like physical work, that's what gives them pleasure. They wouldn't want to be a brain surgeon, they wouldn't want to be an artist necessarily. Although he regarded everything as art, farming, tilling the fields, gardening was all art and hobbies. But the reward shouldn't be any greater. Who were the most necessary workers during the pandemic? Well, the brain surgeon. It was the supermarket workers, it was the carers, it was the lowest paid members of society, and all of a sudden, they're essential workers. So he comes to pay them. So he would have been taught, yes, that work should be a vocation. We do what we're best suited to, but we've all got more than one skill or more than one creative aspect to us. Why should we be allowed to? But nobody should get more reward from each according to his needs. Obviously, if I've got 3 children and you haven't got any, my needs are greater than yours in terms of food and shelter. That's fine, as long as I put mine back in. Should a brain surgeon clean the sewers? Do I have the toilets? To answer your question. Yes, I think it should be at least half an hour early. To find out what it's like on the other side.
So you're saying some labour is more valuable than others. So is the more
Well, actually, if you look at who probably on the scale of things, who saves more people, probably the sewage worker rather than the brain surgeon. No, let me be clear, right? Those are basic principles of Morris. In Use from Nowhere, he portrays his utopia. He wants you to develop in your mind, your imagination, or I want. But what he is saying is that brain surgeon in the scale of things is no more important than that person who cleans out the sewers or does the dirty work. In fact, they're at least equally important. In some pandemic time, actually. So they shouldn't get creative rewards. And we as a community, because he sees us as operating not in huge national units, but in small federated communities, we as a community will decide and agree on that level of sharing of the labour. You know, I mean, there's certain things I like to do, and I would want to do those, but I'm quite happy to put my hand up and do some of the necessary work. And I think he would argue that so should everybody else.
Mark, I'm aware that there's obviously a number of questions here. I just wonder that some people here might wish to escape because we have been here for an hour.
Feel free, don't worry.
But you'll be here,
Yeah.
Mark will be here.
I'll take that one question then, Rich,
Take
and
one question,
after that,
and we can individually.
It's not really a question. I imagine that in Morris's vision, and hopefully our vision, so-called disabled people wouldn't be separated from the rest of the community as what we see in our current economic system.
absolutely not. Morris had a severely epileptic daughter, and she stayed with the family and in the family and was looked after by nurses. There's never was she separated out, never was she treated any differently to anybody else. So absolutely not. No.
Do you want to
A quick question. Did Morris's sister May share his socialist?
May was his daughter.
It was May's daughter. Thank you. And did she share his socialist views?
Yes. His wife didn't. Jane Morris didn't share his socialist views, although she wasn't antagonistic to them, and she would go along to the meetings and sit in. But she didn't. She was more of an advanced liberal, shall we say. She didn't get involved in politics after Morris's death because she helped him by a considerable length of time. But May, Jenny was his eldest daughter. She was severely epileptic. May was his youngest daughter. May was a superb designer in her own right. But yes, she did share his socialist beliefs, and she was active in the Socialist League with him.
Thank you.
Okay. Any further? I'll chat away for ages. It's fine.